Thank you, Satellite Bush. The light. Welcome everyone to an exciting new episode of ReptilTV, where we explore the fascinating world of reptiles and their unique habitats. My intro animal today for you is a young Uromastix thomasi. You can clearly see the size of the Uromastix thomasi, a beautiful spiny-tailed lizard from Africa. So if you take a look at the pattern on its head, you'll notice this short, round, stubby tail, kind of like a beaver's tail, a bit flat and wide. Really a beautiful species of spiny-tailed lizard. We had the spiny-tailed lizard episode with Jörg Müller in 2001. There you can see the animals up close as well. As I said, this is what small hatchlings look like. A wonderfully beautiful lizard, loves it. Super hot desert terrarium. So I'm a total fan of spiny-tailed lizards, and that's why I wanted to show you one today as my intro animal. I've chosen today's topic to match the season a bit. Winter is just around the corner, and that's why every year the questions come up about brumation or hibernation. It's really a very important topic. Reptiles need this brumation, this hibernation. Of course, not all reptiles, but some of them, we'll get to that later. This brumation, they need hibernation even in their first year. Sometimes people used to say you can skip the first year and so on. Complete nonsense. In nature, no one skips anything either. So you really have to do it in the first year. That's the only way to keep the animals healthy and active. I'll get into that more in depth later, and that's why that's going to be our topic today. First, let's clarify the difference between brumation and hibernation. Brumation is all a bit warmer, so to speak. That happens somewhere between 10 and 20 degrees. In 1,000, the animals are already a bit more awake, be even moving around a little. There might be a warmer day when the animals come out, maybe even have a drink. That's brumation. And then we have hibernation, which is definitely below 10 degrees. The animals are usually completely buried. The metabolism is completely slowed down. Heart rate pulse completely reduced. That's a state where they are, in quotes, completely out of it and don't come out or react at all or aren't awake. By the way, I just mentioned it earlier. Of course, not every terrarium animal goes into brumation or hibernation. So classics like this one, a boa constrictor salmon, by the way, they don't go into brumation. And the king python, our classic terrarium animal, also doesn't go into brumation. And there are actually quite a few other terrarium animals like the various tropical tortoises, Aldabra, sulcata, pardalis, or among the lizards, the green iguana. These are all animals that don't go into brumation or hibernation. They also have a bit of a seasonal pattern, but that's enough for now. So in winter, it naturally gets cooler for us. And when it gets cooler outside and in the apartment, our terrarium will inevitably be a degree or two cooler, I would say. No matter how well our house is insulated, how well our terrarium room is heated, or how well our terrarium is heated, I would say it will still be cooler in winter by about a degree. In summer, the apartment might reach 25 degrees or even more on hot days. In winter, the apartment is 21 degrees or maybe even just 20 degrees, and accordingly, that transfers to the terrarium. And there we have our seasonal fluctuations, and that's all these tropical terrarium animals absolutely need. So I don't have to do anything special. Usually that's enough for normal care. If I want to breed now and stimulate such an animal, it might be that I lower the nighttime drop a bit or something like that. That's another separate topic that we'll discuss in the breeding episodes. But this rhythm is usually sufficient as a standard. These are animals that live near the equator, and there are simply no pronounced seasons with warm and cold like we have here in Europe or like in the southern hemisphere, southern Australia or southern South America. None of that applies here. Here are two classics, the bearded dragon and the corn snake, specifically the anerythristic black corn snake. Just so you don't wonder, corn snakes should be red. These are classic terrarium animals, require a winter dormancy, so I don't have to put them in the fridge. They don't need it that cold, but they definitely need a winter dormancy. That means that in winter I definitely turn off the lighting in the terrarium for about 8 to 12 weeks, to switch off all the energy that heats the terrarium, and also turn off the lighting, and that's usually enough. So in a normal living space, or it's best to have a cooler living space, like, or maybe an office, or wherever you have your terrarium set up. In the past they used to call them ironing rooms. I don't think those even exist anymore, but these are rooms that aren't extremely warm. So I definitely wouldn't do the brumation for these animals right next to a tiled stove in the living room. But these are rooms that aren't extremely warm. Brumate in a cool room, not near heat, or daytime 20 degrees C, night. That's why I just say a cool room. But a normal cool living space, or maybe a bedroom, would work too. During the day it might be around 20 degrees, and at night, when the central heating turns off, a living space usually drops down to about 18, 16 or 15 degrees. And that's actually enough for these terrarium animals like bearded dragons, corn snakes and leopard geckos, which are classics that you can also include. I think that's actually the best way to go about it. You let the animals hibernate in the terrarium. You don't have to take them out separately. You naturally provide fresh water. If you want, you can cover the terrarium a bit more. That way it's a little darker for the animal. But even that, I would say, is not absolutely necessary. And of course, don't feed them during that time. If you're doing this, it also doesn't make sense to feed them on Wednesday and then start the brumation on Thursday. So the animals need to have digested well. I would say to allow at least 7 to 14 days for a snake to digest. For a lizard, I would maybe give it about 4 to 5 days to digest. Then, within about 7 days, if I have 2 lights in the terrarium, I can first turn one off and then 3 or 4 days later turn the other one off. So, if possible, I would reduce everything over a period of about 7 days and then ramp it back up again within 7 days after those 8 to 12 weeks. So, you don't need to make a big fuss about it, just reduce it gradually over weeks. I would say that when I started as a terrarium keeper, they said to gradually reduce and gradually increase, so you don't really make a big fuss about it anymore. You can actually observe that yourself in nature. A winter onset can also happen quite suddenly, and summer and t-shirt weather can sometimes come overnight. And that's just how it is in nature. So it doesn't happen gradually over weeks, but rather quite suddenly. So I'm someone who doesn't really like to drag this out over weeks. When someone asks me, I always say, well, 5 to 7 days to reduce and 5 to 7 days to ramp back up. That's enough. And then you can really provide these terrarium animals with a good hibernation. Then there are terrarium animals, which also include the teos. Here's a lovely red Argentine tegu. A tegu, black tegu. They're relatively common in terraristics. From my perspective, the hibernation is almost the most complicated part. The background is simply that the climate is more or less comparable to the climate of northern Italy, a Mediterranean climate, where in winter it can drop to 0 degrees or 1 or 2 degrees below freezing at night. During the day it can be t-shirt weather with 20 to 25 degrees. Doing that as a hibernation is not so easy. We ourselves made the mistake in the past of overwintering them in a cool room at 8 or 9 degrees, similar to how we do with land tortoises. And that didn't do them any good at all. Or there are also, I know from other terrarium keepers who have made this mistake, if they are kept permanently below 10 degrees, they can't handle that either. That's not what they have in nature. Nowadays, We do the hibernation in a sort of winter garden. We have UV permeable polycarbonate panels under our roof, and that's where we do the hibernation. It's just perfect. We have UV permeable polycarbonate panels under our roof, and that's where we do the hibernation. That's just perfect. At night it can drop below 10 degrees. During the day, when the sun comes out on a nice sunny day, it can even go over 20 degrees. They also come out of their winter hideouts sometimes and look around a bit, or maybe have a drink. And then there are 1 or 2 weeks where the sun doesn't come out and they hide away. By the way, there's a good episode about Teju where you can see how they hibernate in South America. So you put a bit of hay and straw in the hiding spots. I think this hay might have a bit of a composting effect, so it produces a little bit of warmth in the hiding spot through the composting of the hay, so it's not as cold in the hiding spot as it is outside in the surrounding area. If you do it this way, then they have a problem-free hibernation, and after about 3 months or a little over 3 months, you can start to raise the temperatures again. And as I said, it's really important for the tegus or for all terrarium animals that they are properly active again afterward. Then they eat really well, are curious, move around, and depending on their size, they start to mate. So you should definitely do it that way. And then I have the classic example when it comes to hibernation, or in this case it's about hibernation. A Greek tortoise, of course, also needs a hibernation, or rather brumation. That's really important for the animals, or many terrarium keepers who have tortoises are afraid of that. They think, oh no, if it goes into hibernation now, it might not wake up again, and so on. It's quite interesting. There's a study from 2006 that was conducted in France. Aline and Frank created this study about hibernation and mortality in juvenile testudo tortoises. The study showed that among the animals that did not hibernate in their first year, 23% of non-hibernating animals died that year. Nearly a quarter need hibernation for health and growth. Those that did not hibernate, 23% of the animals ended up dying over the course of the year. So almost a quarter, because they simply need this hibernation to be healthy and to grow up healthy. They need that. If you don't do it, 1/4 of the animals will die, and I'll hibernate. The study mentions some animals died during hibernation, ensure hibernation in the first year, avoid delaying to the second year. In nature, no one keeps them warm. So if you want to do something good for your animals, make sure you hibernate them in the first year. Don't think, I'll do it in the second year. That's just nonsense, because in nature, no one comes along and keeps the little tortoises warm in their first year or anything like that. I just mentioned it. It also needs to be relatively cold, so they need temperatures between 4 to 6 degrees to really enter hibernation properly. If you keep the animals too warm, their metabolism doesn't slow down enough. The animals are in such an intermediate stage, which is also absolutely detrimental to their health. So you really need to keep it at those 4 to 6 degrees. It's best to do this in hibernation boxes like the one I've prepared here. Down there, there's moist soil, and on top of that, in this case, there's birch leaves that you put on top. You put the tortoise in there, similar to what I mentioned earlier. You create a transition period of a few days where you first keep it in the terrarium for about a week, or in the open air, depending on how you keep them. If you keep them outdoors, then you automatically have that transition. If you keep the animals in the terrarium during the transition period, then, as I said, you should gradually lower the temperature over the course of a week. Then you put them in this box. This box is obviously too small for this animal. I have this just symbolically. For juvenile animals, this size is perfect. But for adult animals, it should be significantly larger. I have here. There are also air holes in this box. As I said, there's moist soil at the bottom, and on top of that is the leaves. As an alternative to the leaves, you can also use sphagnum moss. What you put on top is really good. The animals will burrow in by themselves. So you just put the animals in there at room temperature. They start to burrow in by themselves. I would maybe leave them there for a day or two at room temperature and then move them to the cool room. You should monitor the whole thing regularly. It is always a balancing act between good monitoring but also not disturbing the animals or disturbing them too much. If I dig the animal out every day to see how it's doing, then I'm obviously disturbing it every day. So I would recommend at the beginning that a transparent box is really practical because I can see if it has already burrowed in and if it's gone. Okay, all good. And then maybe after 3 or 4 weeks, you can carefully take a look under the leaves to see if there's anything. Okay, the animal is nicely burrowed in, so everything is good. And then would mostly observe the whole thing from the outside. What's really important is that you can actually see it from the outside, especially with a transparent box. The substrate must not dry out. It always has to be a little bit moist, but of course not soaking wet or muddy. This leaves or the sphagnum moss that I just mentioned must not mold. Mold would of course also be a cause of illness for the animal. So it must be free of mold. You monitor that. If something comes up or if it really starts to mold, I would replace it at that moment. And so I leave the whole thing for 3 months, as I said, at 4 to 6 degrees. And then you offer your animal a perfect hibernation, or the animal can go into a perfect hibernation. And you can ensure that your animal is just as healthy next year as it was the year before. The difficult part will definitely be finding a place that stays between 4 to 6 degrees. I think the basements that people have nowadays, no one really has a basement that stays at 5 degrees anymore. Most people won't have some kind of vaulted cellar. If you're lucky, you might find a spot in the garage or sometimes in the garden shed. Or you can use those light wells that you have in the basement, where there's a basement window with a light well that might have the right temperature. Or in the end, you might just use some kind of fridge, an emptied out fridge where you can put the animals. Those are the best ideas, I would say. You have to monitor the whole thing somehow or know if this temperature is consistent throughout the year. That's obviously the next challenge. Testing a year ahead is practical to check temperatures. The basement is always 9 or 10 degrees too warm. Starting early is crucial. Wireless thermometers are practical. I have them too. At some point I realize, oh no, the basement is always around 9 or 10 degrees and is way too warm. As I said, if you get into the topic early enough, it's really important. What's also really great and practical is that there are these wireless thermometers, which I also have, for example. You know, you have an app on your phone, like Weather Hub in this case. There I can read the temperatures at different points, can read various sensors. So in my case, I have the breeding areas or something like that in here, and you can read it. There are also alarm thresholds that you can set. So then I'll put the sensor in my garden shed. So you need a working Wi-Fi connection for the sensor. Of course, you just have to keep in mind that it all works over Wi-Fi, but that's really great. This way I have constant control over whether the temperature is right. And one more important tip, mice and rats are real gourmets. And if a tortoise is brumating and you have mice and rats, then you have to be very careful because there's a huge risk that these rodents could nibble on or even eat a sleeping tortoise or whatever. You absolutely have to be sure about that. So that means the container I showed you earlier, like a plastic container, mice or rats definitely can't chew their way into it. So I think you're on the safe side with that, or a suitable wooden box, something like that. But it has to be so tight that you can be really sure that no rodent can get in there and hurt your tortoise. So that's also a very important point. In conclusion, a reference to good literature, some of what I've talked about. For example, I also included this French study in this book, Winter Hibernation, with Thorsten Geyer. It's really a great book. If you specifically have tortoises, I would really commend that to you. So I can share quite a bit in these 20 minutes, but the book goes much deeper, covers a lot more, has great information in it. I can recommend that you don't make any mistakes. As I said, specifically regarding the European tortoises. Otherwise, I hope you enjoyed it. Feel free to give me a thumbs up if that was the case. Subscribe to the channel. Subscriptions are reward for YouTubers, as you know. Thumbs up and subscriptions. So please subscribe to the channel. That helps me a bit. And otherwise, stay loyal to me and see you in the next episode of ReptilTV. Use and